with Mr. Richard Rhodes on Wednesday, March 15th, 2023 at 4:02 p.m. Eastern Time. And guys, as always, if you want to support the show, click on the little red button, locals. You can go support it for like $1 a month for exclusive content and all that good stuff. Mr. Rhodes has been on here several times before. I totally fanboy over all of your books. My favorite of yours is, of course, Dark Sun, The Making of the Hydrogen Bomb. But today we are getting into something that I believe you are doing research on, and that is cosmic rays.
No.
No. All
Well,
right.
that's where I am right now. Absolutely. I'm kind of trying to walk my way up the history of physics from the 19th century to today. And I guess I'm just about at the point where physicists wanted to look at high energy particles, and the only way they could do that, since they didn't have the giant machines that they built later, was to use the natural high energy rays that were particles that were coming down through the atmosphere. The first thing they had to do was find out where they were actually coming from, because they thought they might be coming up out of the ground. They thought they might be the result of something in the atmosphere, but gradually they were able to identify them as coming from somewhere beyond. I think that's pretty well been established at this point, that they're the result of all sorts of the kind of amazingly high energy events that occur in the universe among stars and that kind of debris. But it was kind of fun physics from what I could tell. They'd have to go up to a mountaintop, do some mountain climbing to get to a place where they could really get a nice clean look at the sky. And similar adventurous things in order to actually do the work. The drawback was they didn't come very often, and they didn't come necessarily when you wanted them to.
Yeah.
So it was a happy time eventually when they were able to reproduce the same kind of energy levels with machines on Earth, rather than waiting for outer space to drop whatever it happened to be dropping that evening. But what I've really been doing lately, and what I thought we might talk a little bit about, I've been looking at the 19th century beginnings of physics, back when it was still called natural philosophy, and particularly the work of Michael Faraday, who was an English scientist, self-taught. He didn't have any math, which inspires the hell out of me because I don't have much math.
Same here.
He invented the electric motor. He invented the transformer. He really, at the laboratory level, not the engineering level, developed the basic principles of a lot of the machinery that runs our world today. This was a working class guy who was an apprentice in I've forgotten what it was, a bookstore or something, printing shop perhaps, who finally worked his way through to the point of being able to do incredible first-class work that was not based on theory, obviously. He had to work on a lab bench or wherever he worked and put the equipment together himself, and then study what was happening and make sense of it. He finally got a job at what was called the Royal Institution in London, which was a kind of a public institution, a little bit like the Royal Society, but not quite so fancy, where people came to hear lectures on a weekly basis. And this was the thing I wanted to bring up first. What happened to the whole business of people going to hear knowledgeable speakers deliver a course of lectures, working class people who would normally not have had any chance at all in England in the 19th century for an upper level education? Faraday gave these public lectures to working class people all his life because it had meant so much to him. What happened to all that world? I even remember as a boy that some of that was still around. The only thing that remains that I can think of is the Chautauqua summer events that go on, which you probably recall from this last round, was where the Indian American writer was stabbed 5 or 6 times around the face by some fanatic who had found his way onto the grounds of the Chautauqua, which is in upstate New York in the Lakes region. I lectured there once, and it's an inspiring experience. There were 2,000 people who attended my lecture. That's how many people go there and live either on the grounds or nearby for a couple of weeks. It's like summer camp, and listen to people give interesting talks. That's about all that's left. And I sort of wonder, where did that go? Why don't we do that anymore?
I
Is it because online now and on television that people can,
I
you
would
think?
I would imagine that. I mean, it's it's the same reason why I guess I'm able to do this podcast is I talk to people from all over the world. And if I had to get on a plane and go meet someone and sit down and get a hotel, I'd maybe be able to put out like one episode a week versus now, I can talk to people from all over the world multiple times a day. And then it's one, the physical location, right? You don't, if you're working at an Amazon fulfillment warehouse in Tennessee, you can't come up here and listen to us. And then also, if it's a at an event, it's live. That's another
Yeah,
luxury. Do you have that free time? Somebody might listen to this episode while driving a big rig in 2025. So it's
right.
geographic and temporal. It's yes, you lose the that immediacy, that rich vibrancy of sitting in a lecture. I've gone to lectures and listen, and it's great, but it's that's the expense. But the result is that the average person can
Yeah,
access so much more information. So it's a trade-off, I suppose.
right. In fact, if I thought twice, I would have thought about all this. In a way, people have more access
Yeah.
to it. It's the New Yorker cartoon with the guy holding up his iPhone and saying, "Theoretically, I know everything."
Yeah. Yeah, no, but really, right? And that's an amazing thing is, and then this is just one podcast. You can stop
Yeah,
halfway through, jump to another lecture, and I would say it's more accessible to every, and then just does the individual want to seek it out on their own? That's, you can't force that.
and it's monetized with what? With advertising.
Yeah,
In
and
your
that's it.
case, it's
Yeah. Say again.
basically subscription.
Well,
Is
no,
it?
it's like per thousand views, right? It's like, I think it's called an impression on Spotify or Rumble. There'll be an ad for IKEA or something. So yeah,
It's
it's
really?
yeah.
Yeah.
I would say that's where
Well,
it went, and it's also kind of fascinating because not only can the average person listen to it, but now the average person like me can be the lecturer. Like I can start a show and just start talking.
I'm not sure you're an average person, Tommy.
Oh,
But anyway, well, no, in fact, one of the things that I think we probably do miss, just because being in the room with someone like Michael Faraday demonstrating an experiment that he's done, at the, I think it was at the Royal Institution. Yeah, it was. They had, in order to get a power supply for these experiments, they were working with basically fundamental electricity and magnetism, making a spark between two wires. But if you're going to lecture to a whole room, you had to have a bigger spark, as it were. So they had 2,000 batteries, big old liquid style, I mean, kind of old car batteries, basically similar, down in the basement, wired in series. So they would get this enormous flux of direct current whenever they needed it and blow stuff up and make smoke. Or it was kind of magic show cum science lecture, and people really enjoyed them. And I think the people who demonstrated, in fact, one of the basic breakthroughs in physics in electromagnetism came when a Dutch demonstrator at a public lecture performed an experiment that he never done before and realized that he was demonstrating that if you put two electrified wires close to each other, they have a magnetic field flowing between them. The basic principle of the transformer, really. That was actually done to his surprise in the middle of a public lecture he was giving. He didn't know he was going to get this response. So it really, in that sense, there's a certain amount of thrill that's involved in being present when these things happen, of course. But on the other hand, they can be beautifully demonstrated online, as we know from looking at good documentaries and things like that. If you want to see a nuclear weapon explode, you can see it right there. And you don't have to be close by when it happens,
Yeah.
as it were. Yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah.
well, it's really interesting to me that people were so, I guess one of the things it says to me, and this is the deeper thing I'm picking up as I start studying physics in its early history for the first time, and that is physics is actually, as someone, I think Feynman may have said, physics is very simple, but it's very subtle. And you see this when you see people like Faraday putting a coil of wire next to a magnet and pushing the magnet in and out of the coil of wire and discovering that he could get an electrical current flowing in the wire just by moving a magnet in and out of the coil. That's so simple. I mean, you wind up some wire and you get yourself a bar magnet and you push the two back and forth. But the principle that he discovered in the process had enormously profound effects because he was basically demonstrating electromagnetism, and that's what runs most of our world these days. So in that sense, I'm beginning to realize that this science that has always seemed rather formidable is in some ways is not so formidable. And in other ways, of course, is terribly formidable because trying to understand what's actually going on turns out to be immensely complicated. And because it's evidently easier to do a lot of things mathematically rather than physically, rather than with your hands on an object, it's gotten very, very obscure. It's like people who work in the have their own special language that the rest of us have never learned.
Yeah.
And Feynman says in one of his lectures, you can't understand physics without having a lot of math, which surprises me because Feynman worked very hard to make everything clear, including his famous little diagrams, which are like little miniature cloud chambers with little particles flying around. And he drew them out like cartoons. And yet I see his point. Obviously, there are things that are more clearly presented through mathematical structures than speaking a language. But I'm trying to do it without the math. So
Good.
I'm beginning to think it's going to be possible. So,
Good. There are people like me who, like you, absolutely despise math, and math despises me, but I still like science. So there's a mutual agreement between me and science that we're going to find a way to understand it not using numbers.
yeah, and of course you can always do analogies. Feynman's argument was analogies will only take you so far before you get lost.
Yeah.
And the question, of course, then is how far do we need to go to at least have a general sense of what on earth we're talking about here? And the answer, I think, is we probably don't have to go that far. I'm sure analogies fall apart. They always do. That's why they're just analogies.
Yeah.
It's the old idea that I think this comes from Borges, the Argentinian wonderful, wonderful writer. But he has a story about someone who makes a map that's the same size as the area being mapped, which when you think about it, it doesn't really make sense,
No.
if map that's identical to the real thing, then it's the real thing. It's not the map. I think about, I mean, even actually the one time, well, no, that's not quite right. Of course, it's a piece of paper or cloth rather than the original, but the whole point of a map is to have something you can move around and use that gives you some kind of sense of orientation in the larger landscape you're dealing with. I'm thinking about the way they designed the first hydrogen device, the Mike device, which was a two-story tank of super cooled liquids with a bomb at the top, basically, super cooled hydrogen and so on. To make it, to be clear about what they were doing, the guys at Los Alamos took over an old warehouse in Santa Fe and sealed it off so you couldn't see into it, and built a balcony at one end. So their blueprint was life-size. It was 2 stories high because that way they could really see what they were doing. And they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know how to make this thing. They had to figure it out as they went along. It only took them about 18 months, strangely enough, because it wasn't that, again, here we are, it wasn't that complicated. But they did want to see it at full scale rather than having to scale things up. I don't know if people know it, but before the computer came along to allow scientists to simulate whatever they're working on, and in physics, it's usually some set of objects or mechanism of some kind. The way that let's say you wanted to build a cyclotron for the first time. You started out by making a little tiny version of it. Luis Alvarez, the Nobel laureate who worked with Ernest Lawrence on the early cyclotrons, told me this. He said, we had to make a model, a physical model that actually worked at some scale of whatever thing we were planning to build at a larger size. He said, and you had to adjust everything. A model would have a different electrical input, let's say. It wouldn't need as much electricity or whatever. It all had to be scaled so that you could see in the model what you were hoping to get in the full-sized object. And that was a very different way to think about what you were doing. My son is an architect, and he tells me that he can look at a lot of buildings and tell you which iteration of a particular software package for architectural design was used to make that building.
Really?
Because in the earlier stages of the software, there were corners that it couldn't design that had to be worked out by hand and so forth. And as it got smarter and better, it began to be a problem in itself, because with the software, you could design 2 walls that intersected each other in a way you didn't want them to intersect each other. And you wouldn't really know it. The software, I don't know how this worked, but it would compensate in some way for this non-realistic connection between 2 parts of the building. So he still, to this day, at the beginning of designing something, gets out his paper and some pencils and sketches it by hand and puts in the various parts so that he has he's building a sort of a model there. It's somewhere between a physical model and a piece of software, if you will, when you do a sketch. But he wants to be sure that they're not going to have the kitchen wall running right through the living room,
Yeah.
which is possible with the existing software today. I think that's the kind of problem that they have in aircraft design. It's so easy with the software designing of any object to violate the principles of the physical principles of the real world, because the machine was designed to allow for those things, and it doesn't know any better.
And then there's who is it? Ben Rich of Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, the successor to Lawrence or Clarence Johnson, Kelly Johnson, and he talked about when they made the F-117 Nighthawk, the hopeless diamond, because it's just like this extremely ugly. If you've ever seen the F-117, I mean, it looks alien, but they built it first to evade radar, and then after they had
Yeah.
the model, then they went, all right, now we got to make it fly. And the only way it flies is because it does like thousands of like calculations a second. And I think he said in his book, Skunk Works, he said they could make the Statue of Liberty fly if you had enough thrust and enough computers controlling the surfaces. And in that sense, it's an advantage because you can do things that the human mind couldn't do. But I would imagine there's also limitations. It might be pushing things, especially if the model isn't perfect. It If you're just the slightest degree off on an input variable, it might design something that in the model works, but if the model isn't 100% identical to physical reality, it's a moot point.
Yeah. Well, that's of course why test pilots get paid so well and have good insurance policies. The F-117A wouldn't fly except for, I mean, it was totally aerodynamically unstable given its design. I didn't realize they designed the stealth part first. That makes sense, though.
Yeah.
I have a story back around, I don't know, back when that plane was just coming into service. My wife and I happened to be in Paris for some research I was doing on something, and heard that the Paris Air Show was on. And we thought, well, we've got a few extra hours. Let's go see all the great planes. My wife was a private pilot, so she has a special interest in aircraft. And I've always loved planes since I was a boy in World War II. You know, we used to fly model planes and shoot each other down and all those good things, playing at war as we all did at that time. We went out there and heard people talking about the F-117A. It was on display, but the French were all saying, "The stealth bomber plane is here, but you can't see it." Much lower than all the other aircraft, and really quite small compared to the regular kind of fighter bombers that were around. That you'd walk down this line of planes and you wouldn't see it until you actually came upon the space where it was parked, because it was just moved. It was like a small car, sports car in the middle of a bunch of SUVs. It's tucked away. I talked once to the pilot. This was at a writers' conference, and he was wanting to learn more about how to write. He was a smart guy. I talked to the pilot who flew the F-117A over Baghdad at the beginning of the whichever Iraq war it was that plane was there. He said, I was up at around 20,000 feet playing Bach or something on the sound system. I think the pilot lies down in that plane on his belly. But he said, I was surrounded with this glorious music. The plane is so quiet. Nobody knew I was there because that aircraft had the radar profile of a fly, literally,
Yeah.
of a fly. They basically just thought it was a bug on the machine, which rather than a full-sized aircraft. But he was launching smart bombs out of his plane into Baghdad in this environment where any notion of being someone who was killing people and blowing up buildings was about as far away as it could be. It was clearly for him a moving experience almost to be in this kind of divine power up above. It's like God in his heaven throwing down lightning bolts. Very strange experience.
That's insane. Being in a a black
I,
budget special access program stealth bomber listening to Bach in foreign territory dropping bomb. That's crazier than an acid trip.
well, I mean, the question always is, how easy is it to kill people?
Oh, sure.
And people, our bomber pilots over the years have talked about. I mean, when we firebombed Hamburg in World War II, these planes were flying at about, let's see, what kind of air, flying probably 15,000 feet, which is pretty high. That's 3 miles above ground. But the smoke and the stench of the burning actually reached up to their level, and they could smell it and see it, of course, because the whole city was in a big firestorm at that point. It was the people who had that experience were pretty horrified by it. But this guy, I said, so how did you feel about what you were doing? And I said, did you think about it later? Did you struggle with it later? And he said, I used to sit out by the lake and, think, which I think was a masked statement. He didn't want to talk about it, but nevertheless, the fact is, if everyone who kills people in a war had to do it with a spear and a sword, like the wonderful Viking series that was on television recently, it's a lot harder to do that. It's a lot harder to kill at that level. One of the things when I was looking into violence to write about it, I came across some studies about mass killings by animals. Normally animals kill and accumulate enough prey for their food, for their immediate needs, and then stop killing. I mean, it's a dangerous thing to do. You could be wounded, you could be injured, it could cause you problems. So they don't kill any more than necessary to eat. But there are a few incidents that have been collected over the years, where a pack of wolves got into a huge corral full of sheep and knocked off a couple hundred sheep in one night. And the question was, why would they do that? Why would they kill so much more than they needed? So, and there were several other similar incidents that people had collected information on. And in every case, it was because something obscured their vision. Either it was a very dark night with no moon and they really couldn't see the animals, or it was a fog, thick fog, so that it obscured the number that had been killed. It's as if there's a feedback mechanism that among us predators that stops us from mass killing unless something obscures the degree of such. I take this then over to when I was writing about the so-called bullet holocaust, where SS men and German police forces were trained to go into towns and villages and collect together all the Jews and take them out to a tank trench or a previously dug hole and shoot them into the pit and then cover them up and walk away. Those guys started having breakdowns. It was traumatic to be killing in such numbers, 3, 4, 5, 600 people in a day, just shooting, while they're right there in front of you. So you can see it happen. And it was clear by the time I finished doing this research and writing this book, which is called Masters of Death, that the reason Himmler, who was in charge of the SS, decided to find some other way to do the killing, the mass killing, is because of the trauma to his killers. So when they developed the gas chamber, it wasn't because, we talked about this before, it wasn't because it was more efficient. It wasn't more efficient. It was because it reduced the trauma to the perpetrators. So, in other words, basically, it put the killing out of sight, just as is true with people in bombers, and was true with these mammals these predators that were killing to eat, but then got triggered by not having a feedback loop that told them it was time to stop. I find these things really, really interesting because they're so way down below the level of higher consciousness, if you will, or human rational thought. They're really, really elemental in a way, and I don't think they've ever really much been explored. They intrigue me. I wish we could explore them more, but there's no way to do experiments along these lines, I'm afraid. You have to experiments. Yeah.
Yeah, I've mentioned that exact thing before from your book, SS Einsatz's on SS Einsatz's group in Masters of Death. I've talked about that before, how it's what appears to be one thing is, the trope of German efficiency and cold calculation was insanely enough. It's so twisted, but it's a weird form of caring for your fellow man, your fellow Aryan master. You don't want him traumatized. So you're doing this weird thing where you're putting him in trains, right? There's only how many people on the train that have to operate it, right? You close the cattle cars, you rush them all off, you put them in the showers, and then you have the Sonderkommando. You have Jews go in and pull the bodies out, again, not Germans, put them in the crematorium, and then they grind the bones up, and then they throw the ashes in the lake or the river or whatever. And it was all because you didn't want your fellow German brother to be scarred. It's the most insane. I mean, if that is not the definition of the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I mean,
Yes.
it's wild, absolutely wild.
Well, of course, in time of war, we all do a lot of killing. Our young men, as it were, and so on, and the other side's young men and women these days. And rationalizing that kind of slaughter has been one of the big jobs. And it's what's involved in all the statues and the flags and all the rest. There's a really extraordinary book that I remember reading and cherish as a guidepost to some of this by a woman, actually an English professor and philosopher named Elaine Scarry. It's called The Body in Pain. And one of the things she looks at is what exactly is war about? Since wars don't necessarily end when the last man is dead on the other side, since wars don't necessarily end when the supplies have run out, what exactly does lead to a victory in war, and why? How does that come about on the part of the people who surrender? And she points out, I think most of all, the wars are about, they're kind of like a potlatch ceremony. You throw your best young people into a mass killing situation, and you do it as a way of saying, we believe in our principles and our way of life more than you believe in yours. And the ones who finally come to the conclusion that they've lost come to that conclusion because of that failure. I mean, in a way, maybe we're talking about what's going on in Ukraine right now.
Sure.
I've never seen a vivid example of one side full of belief in their and hope for themselves, and the other side just, oh Christ, do I have to go do this? You're going to make me go kill myself running in the front lines because of your government and your life? It's really been interesting to see what happens when one side isn't motivated truly. They end up running all their prisoners out of the prisons of the former Soviet Union and throwing them into the lines to get shot down. It's quite interesting to see how so Putin is left basically breaking down the electrical supply system in Ukraine, generally just killing people to kill people, hoping that it'll break the spirit. And that's the point that Scary makes. It's ultimately about breaking the spirit, if you will.
It's a it's a weird auction of
Yeah.
who's willing to. How much do you want me and Mr. Rhodes, we're both eccentric billionaires, and there's a Model T, right? And I'll pay 5 million, 6 million, 10 million. And it gets to a point where even like an Elon Musk and a Jeff Bezos are going to start going, am I really about to pay 50 million for a Model T? They've got all the money in the world, but there is a certain point where they go, they'll pay a lot. I think Jeff Bezos paid like $100 million of his own money to have one of the Saturn V engine bells pulled up from the bottom of the ocean because he just loves rocketry. But even he probably had an upper ceiling where he was like, I wouldn't pay that much.
Well, look at the level of contest. Now it's going into orbit. That's the latest level of contest among the uber wealthy guys.
Yeah.
They, they can't, after all, just
Yeah.
make that goes back and forth all the time. There's even a chart online that day by day shows who's the richest today. But they can say, I'm going to go in orbit and wear a spacesuit and all that and so forth.
It
That's the level, you know.
it is
It's,
a
it's
it's a weird, like, if you observe all of humanity as like a superorganism, and thus we're all one, and Bezos and Musk are these weird appendages full of energy and resources. It is almost this, like, we are kind of benefiting from it, right? If you're just accumulating ones and zeros in the bank, I feel like that maybe has a detrimental effect on society. But if we can align their interests or our interest, where it is in the human species interest to get off the planet, and then make it a game where for them it's ego stroking, I think that's kind of a brilliant, I guess, meta mind use of, because I mean, right, you can only build a skyscraper so high or have so many Lamborghinis before it's like we're no longer adding benefit to society. But if the new, excuse my French, if the new pissing contest is make an interplanetary species, but I think that's probably good.
yeah. The only thing is, there's so many people who are just barely making it in the world.
Of course, yeah. And then, yeah, I mean, most people live in abject poverty and don't have clean drinking. I mean, that's obviously the dark underbelly of it.
I'd rather see a much higher tax rate personally.
Oh,
Although the way Washington these days, I'm not sure about that.
oh, I'm
you
I'm
know,
I'm speaking purely as just an objective
I know.
observer. Yeah, yeah. I'm just looking at it as like they're not going to listen to me anyway. So to me, I'm like they're not going to listen to my call for a tax rate or socialized medicine or whatever, or the end of war. So I might as well like cheer for maybe it'll be better in 100 years. I don't know. I don't know.
Paul Newman told me once that when the tax rate on the upper levels of movie star wealth was 90%,
Oh
he
yeah.
said, we just didn't have many movies. We just made 3 a year, because when you got to the marginal tax rate of 90%, it just wasn't worth the trouble. So, and since one of my theories about Hollywood is the reason they're always having marital problems because they don't have enough to do, I think that probably spurred any number of problematic marriages and divorces in Hollywood. That's one of my favorite crackpot theories. I'll spare you the others.
No, I no, I like it. I mean, I think it's great. I think it's uh yeah, I don't know. I had some theory. I just forgot what it was, so never mind. But I had a crackpot theory at
you
the
know,
end.
interesting thing talking about them coming around to giving us goods. Eddie Lamar, about whom I wrote a book a few years ago, didn't enjoy drunken parties. She didn't drink. And rather than, she enjoyed a quiet dinner with some intellectual friends because she was very smart. And so she set up to a hobby of inventing things. And out of that, as you know from previous conversations, came her invention of what's called frequency hopping, which is basically a way of moving a radio signal around in a timed way that's matched to what the receiver's timing is, so that the signal can't be jammed. And she did that because she was helping to prevent German submarines from torpedoing shiploads of English children, as they were doing early in the Second World War. The children were being shipped off to Canada to get them out from under the bombing of the Blitz bombing. And the Germans were torpedoing these passenger ships with children aboard. She was horrified and decided there must be some way to prevent that. And the way she was thinking about was improving the accuracy of submarines and their torpedoes. But the main problem with controlling a torpedo with radio, as she saw it, was that the signal could be jammed between the plane and the torpedo, or the ship and the torpedo. So her answer was to think, well, if the signal hopped around all over the frequency, she played the piano very well, and she was experimenting with hopping around on the piano. So that the way to would be to make the signal hop around linked to the receiver, so that the two would move together from frequency to frequency in a pattern that nobody could quickly analyze in those days and reproduce. And that would therefore prevent that signal from being jammed. Torpedo could be guided, and it would take care of the problem of German submarines destroying ships. So with the help of a composer named George Antile, who knew quite a lot about electronics, and some other scientists, they actually put together and patented a frequency hopping system. Many years later, when this thing was finally declassified, they gave it to the Navy, which threw it in the safe. They weren't interested. But many years later, when this was declassified and made available for commercial use, it became the basis for Bluetooth and a lot of other systems. First for car radios, because if you only had 100 frequencies in a given area, you'd only have 100 car radio conversations going at the same time, which would not be commercially viable. But if you could make the signal hop around at a frequency of several times a second, if they interfered with each other, you wouldn't even know it. You wouldn't hear it. It would just be an inaudible blip. And then the conversation would continue, and you could have thousands of conversations. So it was first applied to the old-fashioned car telephone, and then with the appearance of digital systems, it was applied to Bluetooth, to some cell phone systems, not in this country, because someone came up with a cheaper system. The cell phone manufacturers, of course, preferred that one, even though it wasn't as effective as Hetty's system. She came up with something very fundamental that, I mean, it's kind of like Faraday and his developing the basic idea of an electric motor. So these things do sometimes come back to give us something good, but that's a rare exception. Usually they build theater halls and monuments to themselves.
I guess that's how I kind of how I view things. It's like it's like whenever there's like a big banquet dinner or a casino night, and like 50% of all proceeds or something, or like a big poker tournament, and 50% goes to children's cancer research, and they raise $10 million, and 5 of it goes to there and 5 goes to the winner. And you ask, like, how come all these people didn't just donate the money? Well,
Right.
ultimately they didn't, right? And they didn't. And 5 million is better than 0 million. And I know that's kind of a jaded way of looking at it, but human incentive is a very real thing. And although a lot of times, the majority of times, it just produces ostentatious wealth or kind of meaningless luxury, I still think it has a higher success rate. It's like saying 0% versus 5%. I mean, technically 5% is better, but not by much. But I think if we can guide people with this insane desire to create and have wealth, and they, it's all ego. I want my name in the history books. I want to be a Carnegie, a Rockefeller. I mean, would we have a uniform steel system or oil system or railroad system without these guys? And was there wild disparity in wealth? Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't think that those things would have just arisen. You have to harness it. It's a dirty energy that I think you have to harness, and it's imperfect, but I think it's the best we have, if that makes sense.
Well, I think I think you're right, because those basic motivations are pretty much built into our model of monkey, if you will.
Yeah.
If they're there, they might as well be turned to good use. I'm the guy who used to, when I was a somewhat pious Methodist, high school student who was going to be a minister. And our youth group used to get together and vote to spend some of our savings money on a Coke machine for the basement of the church. And I'm saying we should be giving that money to missionaries. And everybody is saying, get out of here.
Yeah.
I mean, that was what a prig. It
Yeah.
didn't harness basic human need to climb up the pole, if you will. So, that reminds me of one of the odder facts I picked up when I was working on my book about Ed Wilson, the scientist E.O. Wilson, because he had a real breakthrough in thinking about evolution when he went with a colleague of his to a monkey colony off the coast of Puerto Rico on a little island just about 50 yards off the beach, where there was a colony of, I think they were rhesus monkeys that had been living wild for a long time, had been moved there in the 1920s from India, and then had been allowed to just develop as it developed. So it was basically a wild colony, and they used it for studying. But Ed mentioned to me in the context of that experience of his, that when a dominant monkey is deposed from his dominance by a younger and stronger monkey, his testicles actually shrink. He produces less testosterone. I mean, that's how fundamental this whole process of ranking and dominance in those types of animal groups that function with dominance ranking in social groups. Ed also told me, warned, don't stare at the rhesus monkeys there. That's considered a threat. And he made the mistake at one point of looking at a really cute baby monkey that was in some mom's nest. And one of the males saw him and stood up and pounded his chest and came jumping over to him. He said, I had thought of rhesus monkeys as small. And, they're not that big. But this was a typical young male, and he weighed about 200 pounds, and he was all muscle. And he was standing in front of Ed, baring his teeth and staring at Ed, just ready to pounce and eat his head off, if you will. And Ed did what you're supposed to do. He dropped his head, bowed his head, looked down at the ground, humbled himself in front of this young male. And the young male stood there for a while and then huffed and walked away like, oh, you're not worth the trouble. It was the beginnings of Ed Wilson's thinking about sociobiology in terms of how social groups interact and what level that's learned and what level that's genetic. And he figured that the genetic part had a pretty strong component, and I think got in great trouble for it from some Marxist scientists who wanted to believe that human beings have no genetic behavioral patterns, that it's all learned, because the whole Marxist world is and has always been about transforming human beings into different beings, as it were. And you can't do that if it's already hardwired into your system. So Ed got into a lot of fighting and trouble back in the 70s. But his point was, he really did take to heart that rather scary experience with this young male.
It is. I think that perfectly described is, if it's hardwired into us,
yeah,
it's going to be next to, if not entirely impossible, to simply force it to be something like a hydroelectric dam is very zen in that you're moving with the thing that's already the earth is churning up this energy. We're not paying for the tectonic plates. That's just going, and that's powered by the sun, which is the moon, and move with it, right? Don't try to stop it. Just move with the thing. And that is the best way. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But move with. What has brought about the most quote unquote stable world in the history of man, and everyone having a nuclear weapon pointed at each other. Insane,
Yeah,
sure. But it's kind of working. I mean, all things considered, it's kind of working. So it's like if it's stupid but it works, then it ain't stupid.
I've just been going through the manuscript of a book that will be out, I think, in about a year by a wonderful scholar of that question named Ward Wilson, whose book is about how to eliminate nuclear weapons realistically, not because it's morally a better world or anything else, but based on a very simple premise, which is they're lousy weapons. The real reason they haven't been used is because no one's been able to figure out a reasonable use for them. Uh, they're too big. They cause too much radioactive fallout. They just, if you get attacked back, the deterrence argument, you're in even worse trouble. Just all the things you can think of for how would you design an absolutely cruddy, useless weapon of war. There's nothing quite like a nuclear weapon. And I realized as I was reading through Ward's manuscript that, and I don't think he knows this, I'm going to have to discuss it with him because it's an important point. The whole work of our national labs in the weapons design business, once they got to the point where they were building warheads designed for a certain size missile and scaling the weapons down to fit the warhead, there's been a general decline in the yield of our nuclear weapons. There was during the Cold War, over the whole era of the Cold War. The first ones were huge. They were megaton yield. They were 5 megatons, which is an ungodly amount of explosive force. 5 million tons of TNT equivalent. Largely because Curtis LeMay, the head of the Strategic Air Command, only had bombers. He didn't have missiles yet, didn't have any other way to deliver the weapons. And since bombers can get shot down, he wanted the maximum yield for the weapon that bomber was going to carry. And that was the way the Air Force pushed. The reason they destroyed Robert Oppenheimer in the security hearing he went through in 1954 was partly because the Air Force didn't like him suggesting we shouldn't build giant weapons, that they really weren't very useful. He was in favor of small tactical weapons, that's where I'm going with this. So ever since we got to the point where we were designing weapons to match the delivery system, the next game at the labs has always been to try to figure out a way to make these weapons usable by making them low enough yield to actually be able to, let's say, take out a bridge. Or in the case of air-to-air rockets, which we had, believe it or not, with nuclear warheads, to just take out a squadron of the enemy's planes in the air. Or a torpedo that would just take out an aircraft carrier, but not blow up the entire South Pacific. So in a way, the whole move towards smaller and smaller weapons was in the service of responding to what is indeed Ward's well-taken argument against nuclear weapons, which is they're too big, they're too messy. There's no way you can use them. There's a risk that your own forces will be destroyed by the same explosion that destroys the enemy. They're almost as bad as poison gas, which never really got very far, primarily because it was on the wind. It would blow back across your trenches and kill your people. So in the end, everybody was prepared to sign off on let's not use poison gas. So the problem, I've forgotten where we were going with this discussion.
Who cares? Keep going.
Here we are talking about all the ways kill people. I was talking about developments.
I was gonna say I would disagree with him, and I would say they're wonderful weapons if our end goal is to have less warfare. I would say these things are great. They are so sloppy and so, I mean, there's the thermal pulse, there's the shock wave, there's the radioactivity, there's the EMP. I mean, you kill your own people. The land is uninhabitable. They are so insane that
They
they
are.
can't be used. To me, they are wonderful weapons because they are so. We're talking about, chimps and our genetic hardwired. I mean, these guys are willing to throw billions just to have their name on the rocket. Think of Alexander the Great or Hitler or Napoleon or all the empires and the millions of people that dictators will just, without blinking, say, yeah, kill them all because they want power. We are dealing with the most insatiable, primitive reptilian mind. The only language that mind answers to is violence. And like the chimp standing up and staring you in the eye, that's what a 10 megaton mushroom cloud is. That's the only way you get a Hitler or a Xi or a Biden or whoever, a Trump. The only thing that gets those egos to sit back down is looking at the power of God. And to me, I, I think they're great for that reason. We're dealing with hardwired genetics.
The problem is that since we're doing this at the level of actual weapons in actual silos and on actual planes and in actual submarines, we take great risk.
Well, that's the
because if inevitably something fails, as all mechanical systems do, we risk being destroyed for no reason because the system just broke down. And I mean, the system does break down, God knows, and came very close many times during the Cold War years. I mean, there was a bomb that was dropped over South Carolina.
Yeah, Greensboro.
Right. That evidently all the safety interlocks but one actually was triggered. So, and so forth. So my argument is the same one that Oppenheimer and the crew put together in the Acheson-Lilienthal plan in 1946, which is if you have a world where you know where all the weapons or materials are, where you have perfect transparency about the possibility of anybody secretly testing and so forth, then you can back off from using weapons, from keeping weapons on hair trigger alert. You can move them back to it takes 2 hours to launch. You can move them back to where it takes 2 days to launch, basically just by taking them apart and moving the parts to different places, which, by the way, is the way India maintains its nuclear arsenal to this day, because they don't want anyone to be able to steal one or don't want any faction to be able to take control of them. They keep them physically separated in different vaults around the country so that you have to go through quite an elaborate process to put them back together and get them ready to launch. So it is possible. And if you could do that, if you do that, and if you can make sure everyone is doing that, then you march back progressively from the kind of mistake that is fatal because it happens and then it's all over. You can even get to the point where you have deterrence at the level of knowledge, because no one's going to stop knowing how to make these things. Everyone who has any advanced nuclear technology in their country has already done that exercise, you may be sure. And I mean Japan and any other country. The Swedes were working on nuclear weapons, for God's sake, back in the 50s, and got pretty far along before they realized that there was no point in it once the Soviets got hydrogen bombs, because just 2 hydrogen bombs would take their country out. So there was no point in having some little nukes that would take out a line of march of Soviet tanks if they were ever attacked. Anyway, you can get to the point that the Acheson-Lilienthal plan argues, where you have deterrence at the level of knowledge and, if you will, mothball parts or something at that level. Then if somebody starts cheating, and this is where Bernard Baruch, who was going to present the plan to the United Nations, screwed it up. He asked Oppenheimer, well, what happens if someone cheats? Where's your army? And Oppenheimer said, well, if someone started trying to rebuild a nuclear arsenal in a world like the one we've described, that would be an act of war. And you could therefore immediately begin whatever you wanted to begin. You could begin with negotiation and diplomacy. If that didn't work, you could move to conventional forces. If that didn't work, then you could also, assuming the knowledge of how to build these things was spread around, you could also begin to build a new nuclear arsenal of your own. At the end of this weapons chain, as it were, you wouldn't be any worse off than where we are now. So it's not as if it would be some kind of surrender to some secret enemy working in a cave. I've really concluded that the reason we still have all these nukes, speaking now just for the United States at least, is because of domestic politics, because it allows the Republicans to argue in Congress that Democrats are weak on defense because they want to negotiate rather than build more bombs. And the pattern is very clear. When Obama wanted to get through another treaty, actually Clinton wanted to get through another treaty with Russia. The price was the so-called modernization of our nuclear arsenal, which basically meant rebuilding everything with keener and more sophisticated weapons. And the same thing goes on now. At the same time, there's a whole military, industrial, scientific complex that lives off of all the money that's spent on these so-called useless weapons, these things that we say we can't figure out how to use. The defense industry has cleverly located aspects of its manufacturing and other facilities in almost every congressional district in the country. They spread it out so that every congressman has a personal stake in maintaining this unbelievably bloated defense budget that we have. They're going to increase the defense budget this year as part of President Biden's balance the budget plan. It's just incredible. We have a bigger we have a bigger defense system, very modern, very sophisticated, than the next 9 countries combined. And yet we hear about how vulnerable and dangerous the world is. It's a very strange business, and it has a lot more to do with politics and money than it has to do with deterrence and the avoidance of war.
There's an author, Andrew Coburn, and
Yeah.
I can't remember the name of it. I don't think he has one book called Kill Chain, but I don't think that's it. There's another one, and he actually puts forward a very good argument that it's not that it's sentient, but the military industrial complex pretty much obeys all of the biological laws of a virus and a host, and the way it attributes, like you said, different districts, and the way it puts its veins into resources, and it sucks out a disproportionate amount without giving anything back, and when it feels threatened, it lashes out. He lays out a pretty good argument, and it doesn't mean that it's some Skynet that's taken over, but rather it has a natural system has arisen that this thing is, there almost is no head. It's this autonomous law of just resource acquisition, and it's the biggest, baddest thing on campus, and it'll bomb you into oblivion, and it's essentially become not self-aware but self-sustaining, and it doesn't need a head anymore. It's just growing.
And it's all the classic definitions of a parasite.
Yeah.
It is a parasitic system. And parasitic, one of the things that I'm picking up, and I think, again, this is Feynman making this analogy, but he said it's as if there are 2 realities in the world. There's the one we all live in, which is open and clear and sunlight and so forth. And it's basically understandable in a straightforward way by all of us to a greater or lesser degree. Under that, there's another level of reality that's almost entirely inaccessible to our normal sensibilities. And that's the one that physicists work with, basically chemists to a degree. where the underlying processes go on. I think that leaves out maybe an inner layer where the biological structures and things move on. So many things that we think of in a different context turn out to follow the basic system of Darwinian evolution. And that I mean, there was a physicist, there was a scientist a few years ago, I don't know if he's still living, who worked out a model for how memory works that was basically Darwinian. That is to say, you remember things if you use them, and if they're not useful to you, they tend to recede slowly into nowhere. Which, if you think about it, is basically the pattern where use and value and improved value determines which of various genetic mistakes, basically. Failures of copying of DNA, as Francis Crick described it, leads to various possible changes in what will be reproduced. And then Darwinian evolution takes place to find out whether that mistaken transcription, which produced, let's say, a slightly better sense of smell, or maybe a slightly worse sense of smell, will decide whether that line will continue to be reproduced down through the years. I hope that wasn't too obscure. That's the way evolution works. Two-part thing. One, copying mistakes, just as we all make when we're trying to transcribe something. But this happens to be DNA. It's very much like spelling mistakes and so forth. And then the pressure of the environment selecting, as it were, selecting because it's not a conscious process. As you say, there's no head. It's just what works and what doesn't work and what allows someone to differentially reproduce more. I mean, you can even see where that monkey rank order comes from. The stronger, the wiser, the smarter, the more clever monkey has more offspring because he's able to breed with more females. And the females choose the ones that maybe look like they're more nurturing and so forth. And both sides working together end up theoretically with a better monkey at the other end of the process. And then environment changes, and then those adaptations turn out not to be so useful in the new environment. You know, I'm a pine tree, and my God, it's 100, it's 100 degrees outside today. I'm going to have to die. That's what's happening around here in Seattle. The trees are getting affected by the hot summer weather as everything moves north. So I'm wandering about, but I'm trying to make my point. Of course, systems evolve by themselves. That's how we got here. Unless you believe you were divinely created by a master god somewhere on a cloud, we got here by accident. I'm intrigued as I look at physics there's a brilliant young woman physicist who came from Romania to the United States a few years ago, who is working on the interesting question, well, is it really true that there was nothing before the Big Bang? How could that be so? I just started reading her book, so I can't tell you what her answer is, but it's an interesting question. Everybody just kind of shrugged it off. Well, of course not, except Jesuit priests who used to tell me, yes, but what came before the Big Bang, Mr. Rhodes? Don't you see there was a prime mover? Wasn't that probably God? So they have their argument. But however, my favorite description of how we all began, how the universe began, is in the work of another physicist who argues that what we think of as empty space in physical terms is full of quantum particles bouncing in and out of existence. And at some point, one of them got stuck on this side of that wall, if you will. And that was the original singularity that began the universe. So we were created, as it were, out of nothing, which I just find totally charming. It's just the greatest idea I've ever heard. Just because there's a constant probability of certain things happening, even in empty so-called space. There's a very low probability that once in a very great while, something that would normally have winked back out of existence in a fraction of a trillionth of a second got stuck. And that would be the beginning of all of us and all of everything. Isn't that nice?
It
I like
is.
that a lot. Bearded guy on a cloud myself.
I like I like it because it implies if it can happen once, it can happen again.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
and thus,
Even
which,
though the probability, oh, we've got all of eternity, so to
well,
speak.
that's
I
the
mean,
thing. Probability can be
there's
0.0000000. Multiply it by infinity, the probability then rises to 100%.
yeah, right. That's an argument against keeping a bunch of nuclear weapons around, by the way.
That's a fair point. Is eventually we will mess up. We are walking a tightrope.
Uh,
Well, um,
we've certainly round and round,
these are the
coming around
best
the
ones,
mountain.
though. These are the best ones, though. It's the genetic mutations where there is no direct evolution. We're just copying and printing words and sentences. These are my favorite podcasts, are the ones that just go off and
Yeah,
they don't need to make sense. These are my favorite.
finish that story about Ed Wilson when he finally argued that maybe 10% of our social behavior, and he doesn't mean specific behavior, but rather predisposition to be able to learn things, for example. Maybe 10% is genetic and the other 90% is learned. I then looked online for scientific research into how much, and it turns out there was a meta study done some years ago that pulled together every study for the last 50 years of identical twins. And it looked at something like 110,000 pairs of identical twins around the world where records had been kept. And it concluded that about 45 to 50% of behavior is indeed genetic. I mean, I think Ed was kind of trying to get out from under all these attacks he was having from the Marxist scientists who didn't want him to have even 1% when he said, well, maybe 10. Because if you allow 10, then you can allow more. It's how much would I have to pay you for you to sleep with me tonight? Would you take $1 million? Oh, no, sir. Yes, sir, I would take $1 million. Well, then, would you take $10? No, what do you take me for? We've already established what you are. Now we just have to.
I had never heard that before. I've I've heard I've heard would you sleep with me for $1 million? Yes. Would you sleep with me for 999,999? Yes.
I
Yeah.
haven't.
All right. What about 999,998?
Yeah,
Two.
it's a shorter joke.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Models.
Um. Well, Mr. Rhodes, we've been going for an hour and 20 minutes actually. I say we I say we wrap this one up. I don't even know what to call it. I was gonna say cosmic rays, but I think we talked about that for all 3 minutes. So I don't know. It's gonna be whatever. Whoever wants to discover it can discover it.
It all comes back around to just this unbelievably endlessly rich world and how much there is to always to discover, how
Yeah.
much more how much more hope there is, I think, for the world. I really do. I don't mean to end up with a sermonette, but the bitterness and hopelessness that so many people seem to be expressing these days is so sad. All you have to do is just, I mean, you could spend the next 50 years in your backyard and never exhaust all the riches and treasures that are tucked away out there. You know, Ed Wilson discovered the first appearance in the United States of the fire ant in, in a vacant lot next door to his family house in, in Tennessee as a 13-year-old boy. He was just doing an inventory of the few ants that had made colonies in this backyard. And here was one he'd never seen before, and it bit him. And he realized there was a whole new species that no one had recorded yet. So, with that little Aesop's parable, I'm prepared to stop for today.
No, no, but I think it's I don't think it's sermon. I think it's very real.
It is real.
Is whenever, you know, I get down or depressed or pessimistic, I'll just really sit down, and I meditate every day, but if I have to, I'll do it a second time and just try to look at everything around me for the first time. And it does eventually, it starts, this hopefulness starts to flow when you realize just how magical existence is. So I don't think it is sermon. I think it's very real. It is
Yeah.
it is a world of endless opportunity. You just have to start looking for it.
And I'm 85, so I'm really, I still have that going. I hope it stays till the last hour and beyond that.
I think it will. I'm 32 and I couldn't imagine ever getting tired of this. It's
Yeah.
magical. It goes
Yeah.
forever. Um, but Mr. Rhodes, let's wrap this one up. I'll shoot you a text. We'll schedule the next one. And guys, go look in the archives of the podcast. We've gone over tons of your books, Scientist, SS Einsatzgruppe Group, and Masters of Death. Energy is great. We've gone through more than I can count, and it'll be in the description. And yeah, Dark Sun, my favorite. And
Yeah.
I'm kind of having a brain fart after this conversation. So we'll wrap this up. I'll shoot you a text. We'll schedule the next one. As always, man, I love talking to you. You're a cool dude. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Take care, everybody. Thanks for watching.